The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
On behalf of RBCS and software test professionals, welcome to this webinar on testing best and worst practices. I'm Rex Black, president of RBCS, a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm serving clients ranging from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Since 1994, RBCS has delivered insight and confidence to hundreds of clients around the world. Our team of international consultants deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services to companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. I'm the author of 12 books on software testing, including the bestseller, Managing the Testing Process, and 4 books on the ISTQB program. RBCS is presenting this webinar in partnership with Software Test Professionals. Check out their website at www.softwaretestpro.com. Attendance at today's webinar earns PMI PDUs. Thank you, Murali Gathula, for reviewing the materials for PDU status and making valuable suggestions. Attendees will receive an email telling them how to claim PDUs, including the PDU code. PDUs are available for live webinar attendance only. Before we start this presentation, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please feel free to submit them throughout the presentation via your webinar interface, but please note that they are answered only at the end. There's no need to ask for presentation copies. I'm sure somebody will during the Q&A session, as the presentation is on the web at www.rbcs-us.com. Navigate to the Resource tab in the upper middle of the home page, and from there you'll be able to find the basic library, and there you will find the slides. By attending this webinar, you were automatically registered for the free e-learning drawing. Check your email over the next couple days and watch that spam filter. I hope you enjoy this free webinar from RBCS. We do these free webinars as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not just for profit company. So today we're going to start a 2-part series on testing best and worst practices, what works and what doesn't. This session and the next session in July are coming to you from the California RBCS office at Lake Tahoe. It's a nice place to do broadcasts of these kinds during the summer. So, there are good ideas and there are bad ideas, right? I think we can all agree on that. There are some things that you think of and maybe at first they seem like good ideas that turn out to be bad ideas. So sometimes bad ideas masquerade as good ideas. A good idea is a good idea because it's typically going to produce a good outcome. The results of carrying out that idea are going to be positive. And so that's a best practice. And bad idea, whether it seemed like a good idea at the time or was really a bad idea all along and was recognized as such, but for some reason done anyway, is something that's going to typically result in a bad outcome. It's a bad idea because something bad is going to happen. So we can refer to those as worst practices. So what we'll look at this session and the July session are some best and worst practices of testing. Now I want to start off by making sure that the concept and the term is very clear here because there's been some confusion injected into the understanding of this term in the software testing community anyway, even though outside of the software testing community, the term best practice is used quite widely and without any confusion. So a best practice is defined as, and this is, I believe, dictionary.com's definition, a method that generally shows better results than other methods. Okay, so important word there, generally. Okay, generally means more often than not, and under appropriate circumstances and being applied. And better results than other methods, right? Not saying that it's perfect, but just that it's better. Best practice, a better way of doing things than other alternatives would be. One of the ways that I put it that some people like, some people don't, is it's a damn good idea. Most of the damn time, that's a best practice. By that I mean it's a good idea, a good thing to do most of the time, but not all the time. So an example would be, and I borrowed this one from Capers Jones, who I thought had a real good example of it, that it's a best practice to take aspirin to avoid a heart attack. Low-dose aspirin regimen is a best practice for reducing heart attack risk if you are at risk for a heart attack. But if you are allergic to aspirin or the ingredients in aspirin, or if you have gout, which is exacerbated by the active ingredient in aspirin, which is salicylic acid, then you should not do it. So best practice does not mean something that everyone should always do under any circumstances. It just means this is a really good idea. You should consider it. Now, the other thing that needs to be clear here is that best practice, notice the definition above says better results than other methods. Okay? Better, not perfect. So that means that you can improve your best practices. Best practice is not, as I said, something that is the one right way, the one best way to do something. This is the difference between the term best practice and something that is sometimes conflated with, which is a Taylorism. Taylorism was a scientific management technique. Well, it was the name for scientific management in the 1910s, 20s. A guy named F.W. Taylor, in studying assembly lines, came to the conclusion that it would be possible to determine the one best way to do any activity on an assembly line. And that's something that he spent years of time trying to come up with. There are, like anything, there are good ideas in Taylor's scientific management. For example, time and motion studies can be useful in determining the relative effort required to find and fix defects at various stages of the life cycle. It can be useful for doing cost-quality analysis. But to say that there is always one best way to do something is not accurate. So, for example, it's a best practice to classify defect reports so that you can study patterns in those defect reports later. But that's not the same as saying that one can prescribe exactly which classifications should be used for defect reports in every organization, because the right set of classifications will vary. So that's the difference between a best practice and the one best way. Best practice is at a higher level and not attempting to prescribe the exact behavior in every specific circumstance. You're giving a pattern of behavior that generally is going to have better results. And another thing to keep in mind here too is that best practice is a management term. Okay, it's not a scientific term. Okay, so in science, if you can find a single exception to a theory, that disproves the theory, right? So Newtonian physics was the predominant theory for a number of years, hundreds of years, but was eventually replaced by Einsteinian physics because theory of relativity disproved certain elements of Newtonian physics, or at least modified those elements. Now, the fact remains, though, that in almost all ordinary interactions with the world that we have as human beings, unless you're involved in particle physics or something like that, the world is going to behave according to Newtonian physics. So we can assume that, to make the simplifying assumption, that we can apply Newtonian physics to day-to-day life in most cases. Yes, some parts of Newtonian physics have been disproven by Einstein, but Newtonian physics are a lot simpler than applying the theory of relativity. So it's certainly valid to make this general assumption that if you don't happen to be traveling very close to the speed of light, which most of us don't on a day-to-day basis, that our mass is not actually going to be changing from one instant to another. So that's what is meant by this term best practice, so that we don't have confusion here. Now, Another important thing to keep in mind about best practices is that best practices are not a substitute for thinking. Best practices are somewhat similar to documentation templates. Now, I always encourage people to look at documentation templates as a source of ideas about what to document, what not to document, what level of detail to include in documentation, and so forth. You want to be very careful not to think of templates as a fill-in-the-blank substitute for thought. I remember I was teaching a course on test design once to some fairly senior people, including some managers, and one of them kept saying, well, look, I don't need to know about these techniques. My people don't need to know about these techniques. All they really need is template. And then they fill in the blanks of the template, and then they're done. That is certainly a worse practice. And just generally taking a procedure that you picked up from anywhere, from someplace on the internet, from something you heard somebody say at a conference, some blog posting or Twitter posting or something like that, and going, oh, okay, this is received wisdom and I should always behave exactly like this. That is a worse practice in and of itself. So the misuse of a best practice as a substitute for thought is a worse practice. So everything that I'm going to go over here and in the next month's webinar as a best practice is meant to get you thinking and to critically examine things that you do to look for better ways to do them. Not as a, here, just do what I tell you and everything will work out fine. So here's a best practice if you're a tester or especially a test manager. Choose your words carefully. So there are typically four main objectives for testing: finding defects, reducing risk, building confidence, and providing useful, relevant, timely information to the rest of the project team. The thing that you have to keep in mind about being a source of information, being a provider of information, is that the way that you choose to present your message influences how well it will be received, whether people will actually take it to heart. Sometimes there are words that could set people off, be misunderstood, be perceived for whatever reason as insensitive, incorrect, inappropriate. Just the very manner in which you present it, of course, can be off-putting. If you are flippant and acting in an amused way or a light-hearted way about a situation where the ongoing viability of the project that you're on is at risk, then you're going to come across as at least just sort of foolish. At worst, you could be perceived as being an active agent of the project's demise, someone who is glorying in the cancellation of a project or the ending of a project. Now, of course, there are some projects that do need to be ended. So I'm not saying that you want to massage your message in such a way that you hide the truth. If the truth is that this project is dead and it's walking dead man basically, and then that's a message that you need to get across. But you need to be very careful about how you get that across. And since many of us now work in multicultural teams, there can be words that you might not think of as offensive that might be somehow offensive in other cultures, or just likely to be taken the wrong way. And so it would be wise to study some of the cultural hot words, topics to avoid, etc. If you're in a multicultural team, just so that you know, hey, these are things I probably should steer clear of. Okay. lecturing your boss. This is a worst practice. Somebody who is looking to get one kind of information and instead gets a lecture is unlikely to be pleased with that. So, you see this example of a conversation that really would not be productive of the executive saying, well, what are some current testing best practices? Which, this is a question I get not infrequently. I'm doing assessments and, executives will ask me about current testing best practices. Okay? You could say something like, well, there are no best practices, only good practices in context, which is likely to get a response, either audible or in the executive's head, like the one here. Thanks for the smart aleck non-answer. You remind me of my teenager. If you're asked about testing best practices, then think about, the executive level, what are some patterns of testing best practices? And think about what the executive's perspective is and answer that way. Think about what the stakeholders want. When you're communicating with a stakeholder, you need to think about their information needs. And you need to remember that while you are indeed probably the expert on testing and possibly even the expert on quality in any given exchange with one or more stakeholders, that there are other things that they know more about than you. So when you're in a position to share insights into something that you are an expert on, then there's a right way and a wrong way to do that. And being superior, being sarcastic, that's the wrong way. Trying to see the subject from the stakeholder's eyes and make it interesting to them is something that's going to be more helpful. A physicist, Richard Feynman, was famous for being able to do this in his lectures. He was a professor at Caltech, if I'm remembering rightly. Feynman was very good at taking a complicated thing and making it simple. And one of the things that Feynman did that demonstrated this was that after the Challenger space shuttle explosion in the 80s, there was a analysis of what went wrong and a congressional hearing on that. And Feynman demonstrated the reason for the disaster by taking a piece of the O-ring material that had failed and led to the explosion of the liquid fuel container due to leakage of hot gases out of the solid rocket booster. And these O-rings had failed and allowed hot gases to shoot out onto that liquid hydrogen and make it explode. So he took a piece of this material and while he was giving his opening remarks, immersed it in ice water, thus simulating the temperature of the air that day at Cape Canaveral. And afterwards, he after letting it sit there for a while, he removed it and demonstrated how brittle and inflexible it had become. So always try to think about what's the best way to put across information. Always try to think about how to get better, too. Anytime that I'm working with clients doing assessments or doing risk-based testing kickoffs or other kinds of on-site engagements, I'm always pleased when I encounter people, which is more often than not, who are actively searching for ways to get better. And I would assume that those of you who are listening to this are in that category, because otherwise, why else would you spend an hour to an hour and a half of your time listening to a webinar about testing? So at some point in the very, very distant future, we might know everything there is to know about software engineering in general and testing specifically, but certainly right now we don't. We're not even close. So it's very likely that there is absolutely nothing that we are currently doing as test professionals in a perfect way, but we can always perfect. So if you see the difference that I'm making there, perfect is the verb, to improve something, to make it better over time, right? Perfect being the adjective or adverb saying, well, I'm doing this perfectly, or that was a perfect job or a perfect project. Well, no, probably wasn't. It was good, right? But it surely had opportunities to be improved. So look for ways to improve. This is hard. This ongoing process improvement is hard because we get into projects and the projects are about doing some tangible, saleable kind of thing, right? They're about producing some end goal, some deliverable. And as long as that comes out at the end, some people are going to tend to say, well, look, maybe it was ugly the way we went about it. Maybe it wasn't as elegant as it could have been, but hey, it got the job done. Why tinker with success? So with people like that who tend to be skeptical of process improvement, you really need to be able to show them the money, do an analysis to be able to point out where there's waste, where there's suboptimal results being obtained, and get the improvements in place. I'm always careful to do this when I'm doing assessments for clients, is try to come up with a solid, quantifiable business case for every recommended change, because it's painful to change. And there is that perception that, well, change entails some amount of risk. We might break something that works. So you really have to show how the cost and risk associated with making the change is justified by the opportunities and benefits. Some of our clients do this pretty well. They have retrospective processes that they get carried out. They implement the changes of that. I did an assessment for a client in April, and they had a very good process at the end of every project of sitting down and going through and doing an analysis, a quantitative business case-based analysis for what could we do better next time. And this is the key difference. They actually carried through. I've heard of a number of situations and seen a number of situations with clients where they have retrospectives. They do these lessons learned meetings or retrospective meetings at the end of the project, but nothing ever comes of it. There's the results, the findings are disregarded. I remember attending one retrospective meeting with a client's test manager once after a project had wound down. And as we were walking back to the building where the testing team was, I said, well, I thought that went reasonably well. How about you? And he said, I didn't like that at all, though he used other words, a little more earthy way of expressing his distaste for the process that had just occurred. And I said, well, why? He said, because I've been in that same meeting 4 or 5 times. I said, well, what do you mean? The retrospective meetings? He said, yeah, and then they're always exactly the same. It's always the same set of things that we agree were problematic for the project and we should never do them again. And yet at the same time, we do them over and over again. So he said, it's like a drunk telling you that they're going to stop drinking when you know that they're not going to stop drinking. I'd rather just not hear it. I'd rather just not hear about all these improvements that we're promising we're going to make if we're never going to make them. And part of the problem there can be just failure to have a good, solid business case. And it can also be that settling for good enough. Hey, why change? This has always worked for us. We've always done it this way. Process inertia is difficult to overcome. So make sure that you understand what's going to motivate senior management and executives. And when you are putting forth a proposed process improvement, that you're putting it forth in terms of something that's going to really appeal to them. Now, if you've been listening to these webinar series for any length of time, you've certainly at least once or twice heard me bang on about the topic of risk-based testing. And there's all sorts of material on the website to support risk-based testing, templates, videos, and so forth. So obviously, I'm a big believer that risk-based testing is a best practice. Why? Well, Sometimes I run into people, usually not testers, but sometimes testers, people that say, oh, well, we've tested everything. I had somebody say this just a couple weeks ago in an assessment interview. I asked him, well, what's the mission of testing? And he said, well, make sure everything works. Now, in an assessment meeting, it's not my job to educate. It's my job to listen and then later to educate in my assessment report. Certainly that'll be one of the things that I'm going to point out is that the mission of testing is not very clearly understood. Because if you think about what's everything you could test, that's infinite. There's an infinite number of tests that you could run. Now, sometimes people are deluded into thinking they have tested quote unquote everything because they go, well, look, I have the requirement specification and I put the requirement specification into some test management tool like Rational Test Manager or Quality Center or something like that. And I have traceability from my test cases back to every one of my requirements. There's at least one test case for every requirement. Therefore, I have, quote unquote, tested everything. Okay? No. You got to be precise in your language here. You have covered one dimension of potential test coverage. You have covered every requirement, though it's questionable as to whether you have covered each requirement to the exact depth to which it needed to be covered. But only that one dimension is covered. So it's like the management cliche about you give the child a hammer and the whole world becomes a nail, right? This is one of the risks. Give the tester requirements and the whole world becomes requirements coverage. Now, I'm not saying anything to suggest here that you should not cover the requirements. Of course you should. Of course, if you are given a set of requirements, those requirements represent some level of thinking about what the product should do. But there's also a number of things that the product shouldn't do, those being the risks. And in risk-based testing, this allows us to focus above and beyond the requirements to also look at the risks. There are other dimensions of test coverage that often should be covered, and I covered those in a webinar called Dimensions of Test Coverage, which was recorded and which you can hear on the digital library or on our YouTube channel. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. It's dangerous, of course, to make universal statements, but I would say that in almost every organization that I've worked with, when I look at their test basis, in other words, what things they set out to try to cover, that one or more dimensions is missing from that. So this is something that you want to do is do risk-based testing. Also look at, what is my test basis? Now, another thing that can be problematic is a lack of coordination across the different levels of testing. So commonly what you see in organizations is that there's unit testing, which is owned by the developers. There's system testing. Might or might not be called system testing, but this is the testing done by the professional testers, sometimes organized as an independent test team, sometimes embedded within agile teams, sometimes matrixed in an agile team but reporting into a test team. So various ways of organizing that, but the key here being that there's a professional tester involved. And then acceptance testing, again, this can go by different names, but this would be the testing that's carried out by the users or other business stakeholders. So these are related activities. They serve similar missions, but many times they're not coordinated. So what you're going to get is gaps and overlap. Gaps being situations where one or more parties is assuming that one or more of the other parties is going to cover something, and in the end, nobody covers it. So the developers could be assuming that the testers are going to test something, and users assuming the testers are going to test something, and testers could be assuming that the users are going to test it, or the developers are going to test it. As a result, it doesn't get tested. There can also be overlap, too. We've seen situations where testers are testing things that were adequately covered by the developers in their unit testing. And of course, as was pointed out in the previous slide, any test that you perform represents an exceptionally large number of tests that you don't perform, because ultimately performing tests is an act of selection. You are selecting out of an almost infinite or truly infinite set of tests that could be run, some subset of tests that you will run. And of course, that subset is exceptionally small in relation to the set of tests that could be run. So, you don't want to have unnecessary overlap. Now, sometimes overlap makes sense. Sometimes overlap is good. If something is particularly risky, you might want to have overlap. But that should be something deliberately decided in a collaborative fashion. The other thing that can happen is the test results can be very confusing when there's no collaboration. Remember, one of my clients was doing an assessment, and the CEO was talking to the CEO, and these guys make a fairly large, sophisticated investment banking solution. And it's modularized, and and it's also heavily customized by their customers. And between the testing that's done during the development of the product and the testing that's done during the customization of the product, there are about 8 different levels of testing, each owned by a different group. And what the CEO told me was, I get questions from my clients all the time about, well, what level of confidence can I have in the software that's about to be installed in my production data center? What has been tested, what works and what doesn't? And he said, I don't know where to go to get an answer to that question. It's a good question, but I don't know where to go. He said, I can go to any one of these different groups. They're all involved in testing, and each one of them gives me a different answer, and they're not consistent. He said, it's like looking into a kaleidoscope, that there is no unified, consistent picture. So this is something that coordinating test activities across the different groups that are involved can help resolve. Make the results less confusing. All right, I'm going to address this question of schools of testing and why that's a fallacy in a subsequent webinar. They don't exist. What you have are different testing strategies. It'd be like, saying that in warfare there's the school of the tank and the school of the infantrymen and the school of this and that. No, I mean there are different strategies that are used in different battlefield situations, and a strategy that could be appropriate in one situation could be a complete disaster in another. And it's exactly the same in testing. It's the same in any number of business endeavors. So a wise tester knows what the different strategies are that are available and refuses to commit to any one of them, but instead commits to all of them in the sense of knowing what it's good at, where it's weak, what kind of circumstances enable its use, and what kind of circumstances retard its use, and how to adapt the strategy into a particular situation. So, for example, risk-based testing. Risk-based testing is a strategy. I'm a huge fan of it. I think it can be applied in almost any situation, though not any. There are some situations where it's not appropriate, but it's applied very differently in a sequential lifecycle model as compared to an agile lifecycle model. So in a sequential lifecycle model, you do an upfront risk analysis across all of the requirements, all of the features, all of the personas and support configurations and so forth. And then that risk analysis is periodically updated as new information becomes available. In an agile situation, instead, there is a general high-level risk analysis performed during release planning, and then during iteration planning, the specific risks for that iteration are identified, typically in the context of doing the estimation. So this is an example of adaptation of strategies into a particular situation. You also need to know how to blend strategies. Okay, so, for example, reactive strategies like exploratory testing and use of Whitaker's bug hunting or Whitaker's attacks method or Hendrickson's bug hunting methodologies that are primarily about reacting to the system as it's actually presented to you. That can be blended in with other testing strategies like requirements-based analytical testing strategies and risk-based analytical testing strategies. This is something, as I said, that I'm going to cover in depth in a future webinar. So if you're scratching your head going, hey, what is all these different strategies and how can I use them, and so forth, stay tuned, and later this summer I'll get to that. Now here's a general management best practice. It's not just a testing best practice, but it's certainly applicable to test managers as much as anyone else. So one of the reasons that we as testers have a profession that we can call our own is because people are fallible. And think about it. If people were infallible, there would be no bugs. You really wouldn't need to test things. There were never any problems with it. Why would you test it? So people are fallible. And what that means is that sometimes people will do things that are truly great. And other times people do things that are not so great. And sometimes these things are in evidence simultaneously. As an extreme example, Boston Marathon, not the most recent one, but the one before, you might remember, was attacked by 2 terrorists who blew up improvised explosive devices in the crowd and caused death and mayhem. That's pretty much in the category of a not so great thing. But if you watch the videos of that, you can also see that after the explosions, people were actually running towards the victims, not knowing whether there were additional IEDs waiting there to render aid. That's, 2 polar ends of human behavior on display in the space of 15 seconds. And so that happens. People are sometimes great, and sometimes they're not so great. So when people do great things, it's very motivating to them for that to be praised publicly. When people do things that are not so great, generally speaking, that's something that should be handled privately. There could be some rare exceptions to that where you actually have to address someone's misdeeds in a public way. For example, if you had an extreme instance of an employee, say, sexually harassing another employee, and then that the offender was fired, it would probably be necessary to make some sort of public statement of that as to what exactly happened. Of course, you'd have to be very careful about the victim's sensitivities in this situation. But as a general rule, if someone makes a mistake, and it's not a kind of mistake that's a firing mistake, but it's a mistake that they need to make sure that they don't make again, it's going to be a lot more productive to challenge that person, correct that person, coach that person in a private setting. Now, it's also important that whether we are praising or criticizing, that you have specific instruction and constructive and actionable feedback. Back when there were the Katrina floods a number of years ago, there was an unfortunate comment made by the then President Bush to the fellow who was in charge of the Federal Emergency Management Administration at that point. A heck of a job, Brownie, which, not very specific. What was the job? It wasn't very constructive and certainly not actionable, other than to say, keep doing what you're doing, which turned out to not be such a great idea. Things were not going particularly well. So avoid that kind of generic pat on the back, hey, what a great guy you are. But something like, let's say you've been trying to introduce risk-based testing, and one of your test leads has figured out just the right way to pitch the business analysts on coming to a risk analysis session and participating effectively. Now, that's a very specific thing. you want that behavior to be replicated. So, praising the behavior and encouraging the person to work with others to show them how that behavior works would be something that would be very helpful. Now, the anyone can test problem. This is a worst practice that floats around, and it's incredibly long-lived. Boris Beiser used to refer to these kinds of persistent worst practices and bad concepts as vampires, that they would just like come back again and again. And this is certainly one of them. How hard could it be? Just make sure it works before we ship it. Anyone can test. It's something that I've been hearing for years, and it's difficult to dispel. And in some cases, people who are ordinarily very smart people who got good ideas say this. So if you look at one of Schwaber's books on Scrum, I forget which one, but good book, lots of good ideas in it. I think there are good ideas in Agile, so this is not a general dig on Agile. But in that book, he makes a comment that, the team should be not just self-directing, but also people should just float around and do whatever. One day someone can be designing, and the next day they can be programming, and then the next day they can be acting as a tester. Now, if what he meant was that programmers should understand the design implications of what they do and should unit test what they do, then I would totally agree with that. But if what he meant was there is no justification for specialized role of tester, then I have to completely disagree with that. It definitely matters who does the testing. And I've seen numerous instances where people didn't know what they were doing. I had a situation once where an entire enormous multi-year, 100-plus person project ended up dying a slow and painful death because a set of developers in charge of developing one of the core systems, this system of systems was really centered around, did invalid performance testing of their system, in spite of the fact that myself and other professional testers who were involved in the system integration testing were advising them in advance, hey, you can't do it that way. And they sort of like, oh, no, don't worry. We know what we're doing. You don't know what we're doing here. We know what we're doing. And so their test results were completely meaningless, but they did build a lot of false confidence. And so once we went into system integration testing, the performance of that system was revealed to be completely inadequate, and the entire business case for the project basically collapsed, and it was impossible to resolve that in the time remaining, and for various political reasons, nobody would grasp the nettle and redirect the project, basically sending the design of this core system back to the drawing board. And so they didn't do that and were unwilling to do that. The project was a failure. So you need to make sure that the right people are involved in testing. And this is a matter of understanding skills and cultivating those skills. This is another thing that certainly I see done much less frequently than I would like, which would be the active management of the skills of the people involved in testing. Now, another problem that arises here, a worst practice in testing, is what I refer to as the fire hose of data. So this has a number of different manifestations, but the basic idea is that as testers and test managers, we deal with an immensely complex, volatile collection of interrelated data. You've got your test basis, you've got your test cases, you've got traceability from your test cases back to your test basis. Test results can be used to infer the status of the test basis elements via that traceability. You've got bug reports, you've got test environment configurations, and so forth. If you immerse people in all the details of what you are dealing with, they will not understand it. So what you have to do is figure out, well, what do they need to understand? So they need to know at a high level what you're going to cover, sometimes referred to as the test conditions. They usually don't need to get into the individual test cases, the test environments, and so forth. There could be some exceptions to this, but as a general rule, you want to give people the broader view, higher level view, rather than getting down into the weeds, as the cliche goes, into the exceptionally low-level details. Now, testing tends to sit in an interesting place in the overall set of project activities. So there's a lot of stuff that's upstream from us, development, requirements, specifications, requirements analysis, and there's stuff that's downstream from us. So it's the end users, tech support, and so forth. There are touch points and handoffs, not hands off, sorry about the typo there, handoffs, between testing and the upstream activities and testing and the downstream activities. And because these are places where different groups have to interact, what I've noticed over the years is that you have a very high level of project risk associated with these joints, these handoffs. So very important to make sure that you've carefully studied the different touch points and handoffs, and that you are looking at the risks that are associated with those touch points and handoffs, and that you're ready to deal with them. Classic example of this is test environments. It is a very common situation for me to go into a client's site, look at their situation with respect to their test environments, find out that some other organization is responsible for setting up those environments, maintaining those environments, installing test releases in those environments, etc. And that's getting massively messed up and is a huge source of chaos and noise in the testing process and the test results. So it's a very commonly undermanaged risk. I think one of the reasons that it gets undermanaged is that people just assume that that's the way it is. But it's not the way it is. It's the way it is in their organizations. But that's not an inherent element of managing testing. So the smart test manager looks for these joint risks and manages them. So a worst practice, over-reliance on a single metric. So common examples, I see this a lot. Test status reported based on test cases, test case status. And the implication there being, well, we've covered everything with our tests. Again, as I pointed out at the beginning of this presentation, wrong answer. No, you haven't. And so, but if you make that assumption that your tests cover everything, then certainly then when all of your tests pass, you're done. But well, that's not accurate. Because again, the test cases themselves are an abstraction boiled out of the test basis. The test basis is probably incomplete because nobody has a perfect view on this. And there's other interesting things going on. For example, bug counts. But you have to also be careful with bug counts because those can be misleading as well. Saw a situation recently where the exit criteria for testing were primarily focused on the number of bugs at a particular severity level. So there couldn't be any criticals. There could only be 9 highs, but the mediums and lows could be any number. And you can imagine the kind of behavioral distortion that resulted in. That's this is incredible misdistribution of the defect reports. In one case, 80% of the defect reports were criticals and highs. And that's because that metric drove that behavior. It led to people saying, well, if I file it as a medium or low, nobody cares. It'll just get basically implicitly deferred by the exit criteria. So if I care about this defect, I have to file it as a critical or a high. So what you want, the best practice is to identify a balanced set of metrics where you understand how any one metric could be misleading, and you then develop another counterbalancing metric that will show you how that metric is misleading you and give you a more balanced picture. And this is something that I've covered in other webinars, so I'm not going to get into it in great detail here, but just remember, over-reliance on a single metric is worst practice. Having a carefully assembled, balanced set of metrics is best practice. Okay, so as the cliche goes, brevity is the soul of wit. Do not spam the stakeholders with tons of information that may or may not need. Sorry, just a sip of coffee there. So one example of this that I see, copy and pasting the steps of a test case into the steps to reproduce section of a bug report. Well, of course, you need to reference the test case, but generally, you don't need to have the entire test case. Usually the steps to reproduce the failure is less than the entirety of the test case. Another dysfunction that I've seen, same dysfunction, but different level, is test manager sending out all the other project managers these 30-page detailed test case status reports every single day. I've seen plenty of that, and what ends up happening is that people look at it and are like, I don't know what this means, and they either tune out or they go for a verbal status. So basically, if they're going to come to you and ask for verbal interpretation of that information, then you sort of wasted your time preparing the report, in the sense that they're going to come to you and ask questions anyway. So you'd be better off sending them information that was more relevant, and that, at least if they're going to come and ask you questions, the questions are going to be focused and targeted based on the information that you provided them. It's fairly straightforward to figure out whether you're doing this right. You can use surveys and survey your stakeholders about your information. So you can use what's called a Likert scale, Likert. I'm not a huge fan of Wikipedia, but Wikipedia does have a reasonably good entry on Likert scales, so you can look that up there. And, for example, send out to the managers to whom you report your test results 2 statements. I understand the information that is provided to me by the test team. It's one of the statements. The other statement is the information I receive from the test team helps me make better decisions and manage the project better. And you want all of the stakeholders who you're surveying there to strongly agree, or at least agree with both of those statements. If they are neutral on those statements, disagree or strongly disagree, clearly you're not fulfilling one of the key missions of testing, that being providing information. Okay, so that is the first half of our list of testing best and worst practices. At this point, we'll go to the ad as usual here and open up the Q&A panel and start taking questions. So let's see. Bill. Bill has a substantiating my quote that brevity is the soul of wit. And it says, in Hamlet, as he prattled on, Polonius said, therefore, since brevity is the soul of wit and tediousness the limbs and outward flourishes, I will be brief. The irony there being that he was not. Let's see. Laura says, that was really valuable. Thank you so much. You're quite welcome. Robert says, thanks, Rex. Welcome for that. Tom says, great presentation as usual. What are some strong arguments to convince someone who claims anyone can test? That's a good question, Tom. You have to be careful about who's making this claim. Okay, so if the claim is being made by somebody who claims to be one of those anyones who can test, for example, a developer arguing the incredible potency of his or her unit tests as a bug-killing device, you'll want to be careful in the way that you approach it, because, of course, if you're trying to refute the anyone can test argument that's being made by that individual, you are basically saying to him or her, guess what? You are not as competent as you think you are in this regard, and your tests are not anywhere near as strong as you think they are. That's a argument to be made with caution, of course, because you could easily give offense. You might want to refer to some of Capers-Jones's studies on this, where he's looked at the defect detection effectiveness of unit tests and shown that typical practices are about 25% defect detection effective. In other words, we'll find 1 out of 4 bugs. Even if they're done exceptionally well, then generally they're only going to find about 50% of the bugs. So, that at least you've got some objective evidence. And I wouldn't say, don't present that to the programmer by saying, well, you're not as good at that as you think you are, and see, haha, I've got data to prove it. I think the way that I would approach that would be more along the lines of, well, certainly unit testing is important, but, it has limitations, and just bring up the data. So, you don't have to necessarily point out that it's a skills and competence issue. You can just let that float there. If you're trying to make the argument to management, I think you can be a lot more forceful about it, in the sense of you can crank out some data and show, look, this is the relative level of defect detection effectiveness of programmers as opposed to independent testers. Independent test teams generally find about 85% of defects in my experience with assessments. So, you can make that stronger pitch. So, as always, consider the audience, and go from it from that point of view, right? You got to make the business case based on who you're presenting to. Gene says, much appreciated, good info. Thanks for sharing your expertise and knowledge. We'll tune in again. Thanks, Gene. Elizabeth says, I used your book to study for and passed my CTFL test last week. Congratulations. Glad it helped. Doug asks, what are your top 2 testing metrics you must share with stakeholders? Okay, Doug. So it actually would be beyond top 2, okay? But it depends on the question that I'm trying to answer. So let's give some examples. Let's suppose that we're looking at process. We're looking at the testing process. We're trying to assess how good the testing process is. We look at the objective of finding defects. So the metric that I would use to show that the effectiveness of finding defects is the defect detection effectiveness metric, which is calculated fairly simply. Let's say that you found 90 defects in system testing, and then the product was released for acceptance testing and then out to the customers. And in acceptance testing and the customers, between the two of them, they found 10 defects. So you found 90 defects divided by 90 plus 10, or 90%. So that was your defect detection effectiveness. The other thing that I would look at for that metric, or for that objective of finding defects, would be efficiency. So one way of measuring efficiency would be, well, what's the relative cost of finding a defect in testing versus finding that defect in production? And you can use a technique called cost of quality to determine that. Now, that would be if I was looking at process. If I was looking at the project status, then certainly one of the things that I would look at is how far along are we in terms of executing our tests, right? What percentage of tests have been run, probably broken down by different areas. But because of the potential misleadingness of that, or I don't know if misleadingness is a word, but potential for confusion, I would be careful to balance that out by looking at things like what percentage of coverage has been achieved on all of the different testing dimensions, and where do we stand with respect to defects. So the common theme there is identify your objectives to begin with, and the metrics will follow from that. The mistake that's often made is that people start grabbing at metrics, say, I'm going to measure this, I'm going to measure that. Well, okay, so what, right? Just because you can measure something doesn't mean that you should, or that is relevant to someone. You have to be able to establish a relationship between what you're measuring and something that's meaningful, some objective that somebody cares about. Amy asks, will part 2 touch on how professional testers can fit into agile projects? I'm trying to keep these 2 presentations fairly neutral with respect to life cycles and avoid getting into too many life cycle specific issues. We certainly will be addressing agile practices in a number of webinars coming up in the fall. So if you're working in an agile environment, I'd encourage you to stay tuned for those. Mary says, it was a relief to hear that you have no more control over developers than the rest of us when it comes to convincing them that they have made an error in judgment regarding the project that failed for the central component performance testing. Any suggestions for possible ways to be more forceful to get an action sooner rather than have a project fail? Well, that is a good question, Mary, and it is certainly one that I have reflected on many times. What could I have done on that project differently? Well, I mean, there are a number of things I could have done on that project differently, but with respect to that particular thing, that particular failure, the failure of the performance testing of the component prior to its delivery to us, at which point it was too late to do anything about it. I'm not sure how I would have gone about it differently. I did approach both of the senior project managers who were in charge and explained in very blunt terms why I felt that the performance testing that organization was performing was invalid and meaningless. I did not escalate to the project stakeholders who were funding the project. Perhaps in retrospect, I should have. That obviously would have been an exceptionally risky move from a political point of view. I was already in a pretty risky spot politically because this vendor, for God knows what reason, was seen by one of the project managers especially as infallible. Any criticism of the vendor immediately ended up getting bounced back on me by this one particular project manager. I do not know why. It was very opaque. I mean, in spite of me being able to offer repeated evidences of the way that this vendor was basically abusing this client, I was unable to convince the project manager, whose interest really should have been with the client rather than with the vendor, that something needed to be done. So I don't know. It was, there's a legal cliche, legal/political cliche that says bad cases make bad laws. And I think this might be one of those examples that trying to come up with a generalized lesson out of this particular situation on how to handle it might be very difficult. This project was dysfunctional in so many different ways, and I'm careful not to try to extrapolate. But let's get away from this specific one. One of the things that I've found in situations where you have multiple stakeholders that you can approach is if you're dealing with a situation where people aren't listening to your test results, find another set of stakeholders who will. So here's an example of that. We were testing an internet appliance, and this internet appliance could be configured for 4 different kinds of users: kids, teenagers, adults, and seniors. And for the kids and teenagers, there was filtering that was supposed to be applied to websites, basically to prevent them from accessing some of the nastier stuff. And the vendor that had supplied my client with this filtering, it was just crap. It was horrible. And we kept filing bug reports. Would say things like filtering allows kids to see pornographic websites, filtering allows kids to see violent websites, filtering allows teenagers to see websites that show how to make bombs, and these would go to the triage meetings and everybody would agree, yeah, it's must fix. But the person who was managing the relationship with the vendor didn't, for whatever reason, wasn't able to get them to fix this. I don't know what happened. So I had this inspiration one night as I was sitting in my rented apartment in Austin contemplating what to do about this, which was sometimes, show and tell is what you need to do. And the people whose ox is going to be particularly gored by this problem are the marketing people, because that's the black eye that we're going to get. So the next morning I came in and told the folks in the test lab that if they were easily offended, they should take the day off with pay. And now everybody was intrigued. And I said, okay, so for those of you who choose to stay, here's your assignment this morning. You are to find you're to get your devices configured as kids or teens devices and find the 10 nastiest, most disgusting, horrifying, shocking websites that you can. And no fair cheating or copying. Everybody has to have a unique top 10 list. So first one to a particular site gets it. And then what we're going to do after lunch is we're going to have a show and tell for the marketing people. And each of you is going to show them your list. And so I went down and told the marketing people that we had something very important to show them. We wanted to demonstrate a few bugs for them to make sure that they were clear on the impact of those bugs. And we did our show and tell after lunch. And the marketing folks were just absolutely ashen when they left. They were truly horrified because, saying kids' box can access pornographic websites is one thing. Showing them some examples of the websites is something totally different. I don't know what happened next, who said what to whom, but all I know is that within a matter of a few days, we got a new release of software that included an update to the filtering software, and it was a lot better. So sometimes I think it's just a matter of figuring out, who are the stakeholders that I'm sending my information to, and how would I approach that, productively? How do I find the one who cares? And how do I craft a message that's going to really get their attention? Now, in this case, the message was one that shocked. I'm not suggesting that that's always what you want to do, but in some cases, if people are failing to understand the gravity of the problems that you're pointing out, then a demonstration can be helpful. Leona, or Leon, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, says, do you find developers who are taught static analysis methods create and execute better unit tests? Well, I don't know. I haven't really studied that. I would be careful to make that generalization, though, because static analysis tools look for one kind of problem, or certain classes of problems, whereas white box, black box, and experience-based tests go after other kinds of problems and create other kinds of tests. So, to me, I guess I would be very pleased if developers in general, especially if they're going to be touting how great their unit tests are, would really take an interest in learning good test design techniques. We have a course we call Testing for Programmers, and I created years ago, that is woefully underutilized in my opinion, and I know other training providers have that same problem, and it's disappointing. Pijan asks, when are you going to talk about the different testing strategies? Please let us know. Thanks. I don't remember off the top of my head, but if you go out to rbcs-us.com, you can find the schedule for the webinars, and that one is currently scheduled. I'm guessing it's September, but I don't want to say for sure. It might be August. Let's see, Bettina says, what argument can be given to someone who really believes testing in an Agile project should be done in a later stage of the development lifecycle? When a manager thinks there is no need of a QA/tester within the Scrum team, but a separated team that tests everything after the code was released to a release management team. So this is what's sometimes referred to as scrummer fall, where there's not testing happening within the sprint itself. Now, let me say something here. Though. I mean, this is I brought this up in a previous presentation on I believe it was called Agile Testing in the Real World, and you might want to go take a look at that webinar. There is a place for a separate team doing system integration testing that is one sprint behind. Now, I have seen that work. But I think what you're getting at, Bettina, is the problem is not so much that the system integration testing is one sprint behind, but there is no system testing embedded within the sprints. So the way to look at this here is the relative costs of finding a defect within the sprint team as part of the system testing of the sprint's contents versus finding that same defect in system integration test. Try to do a little bit of analysis, come up with an estimate of what the difference is in cost. Be conservative on the difference. It's going to be significant enough that you'll be able to make a strong business case, and then just look at the number of defects that are found in system integration testing that could easily have been found during the sprint. And you should be able to do the math there and come up with an estimate for the amount of waste. Again, be conservative, but I'm guessing it's a very large number. And that's the way that I would approach that if the person I was trying to convince was a manager. If the person I was trying to convince wasn't a manager, frankly, I wouldn't bother with the argument, because the argument needs to be made to a manager, because this is about how to manage and organize teams. Let's see. Christoph says, interesting presentation. Thank you. You're quite welcome. Levi says, thanks, Rex, for all your insights and particular stories. Great webinar. Look forward to part 2. And me too. Thanks, Levi. Shushma says, working as a remote tester, what could be the best way to conduct a survey for the stakeholders, and who can be those stakeholders? Well, to take the second half of the question first, stakeholders generally fall into 2 categories, business stakeholders and technical stakeholders. So the business stakeholders are the ones who are more focused on the business problem that's being solved by the application. End users are business stakeholders. Project managers are typically business stakeholders. Business analysts are business stakeholders. Your technical stakeholders are people like designers and programmers and so forth. Some people can be both. Testers are generally both technical and business stakeholders. So the first step is to identify your stakeholders, who they are, and then identify what they need from you. Why are they stakeholders? You know, what part of your mission as a testing team is relevant to them? And so, for example, executives and senior managers, they are really interested in the information that you can produce, right? So that's how you want to approach developing the survey. Figure out what you do and how it's relevant to them, basically what makes them one of your stakeholders, and then address that in your survey. How well are you fulfilling that objective for them? It is an exceptionally enlightening process if you do it. You will learn a lot from that. Keep it simple. Don't overwhelm people with 50 question survey. Usually these things can be done with a few very, very targeted questions, and make sure the questions are specific. You are asking specifically about what you do. Don't say something like, I am happy with the QA team. That's just meaningless, okay? Think about the 2 examples that I gave you before, right? I receive the information that I need from the QA team, and that information, I understand the information that I receive from the QA team or test team, and that information allows me to make better decisions. Those are the kinds of things you want to really get specific about what you're doing for them. Shalaja, I think I'm pronouncing that right. I hope I am. How do we convey negative results of testing to stakeholders? Well, again, I think you have to consider their interests, right? Again, what makes them stakeholders? What are their interests? How do you appeal to those interests? When I say appeal to, it's not necessarily a positive thing, but you communicate in a way that addresses their interests. And think of the example I just gave you with respect to the filtering. What I realized, took me a while to get there. I should have gotten there a lot sooner. But what eventually I realized was the right set of stakeholders to really care about this filtering problem was not the developers so much as the marketing people. And though the marketing people were involved in the bug triage meetings, they weren't really understanding the practical implications of what those bug report summaries were saying. So I wasn't communicating to them the right way. So because what I was complaining about in our bug reports was ultimately a graphical problem that people are able to see things that they really shouldn't be able to see. It's not age appropriate. I needed to show them. I needed to show them examples. So just try to think about that. It's hard because, what we tend to fall into a rut as test professionals and go, okay, I've got defect reports and I've got test status reports. And, the test management tools, frankly, are not a whole lot of help with this because they provide tactical information that's very useful for the testers and test managers to manage their testing, but they're not able to foresee all of the different information needs that your stakeholders will have. So that's up to you. Let's see. Elizabeth says or asks, is it possible to conduct risk-based testing when you do not have the assistance of the stakeholders or analysts? As a general rule, no. And here's why. Because what I have found, I've worked with a lot of clients to help them get started doing risk-based testing. And the typical way that we do this is there will be a sequence of one-on-one interviews with the stakeholders. And what I have found is that only a few of the stakeholders will be able to identify 25% of the risk items that are ultimately identified. Most of them will get less, but the really good ones will see 25%, and that includes the testers. So if you're not including your stakeholders, if you're just doing it for yourself as a tester, you're going to miss most of the risks. And that's just, empirical evidence to me from having seen this done many, many times. So you really do have to involve the stakeholders. I understand that's the hardest part, to get the stakeholders to involve, and especially if you're maybe a little introverted, or maybe if these business and technical stakeholders consider themselves somehow higher in the project food chain than you. It can be intimidating to approach them, but think about how risk-based testing can help them and pitch them on it that way. I've got a whole recorded webinar on this, on risk-based testing that you might want to listen to pull people in. Gene says, audio goes completely silent sporadically in short bursts. Lost it for about a minute that time. So apparently that's all from Gene, and then Beth has said you went out for a moment. Sounds like there might be some people having some issues with internet connectivity, but it could be at my side. Apparently there were some other people having noisy music masking my voice. I'm not sure what that would have been. So if you did have audio problems, please send us an email, and let us know about that, what specifically they were, and we'll try to address it. Basically, it comes down to what the volume of those problems is. If it's one or two people, then it's something having to do with your connection to the GoToWebinar server. If it's everybody, then it's my connection to the GoToWebinar server, which is something I can do something about. Laura says, I think that people who act superior and communicate to superiors and others in a condescending tone do not normally realize they are doing that. Yeah, I think that's probably generally true. Yeah, it's really hard to see yourself as other people see you. And, you have to have some sensitivity here. You know, watch people's body language, watch how people are reacting to you as you're presenting your message. And some people are better than this than others. I wish I could claim I was really good at it, but I mean, I'm as fond as saying the, clever, witty comment just to be clever without stopping to think about that might really, irritate someone. I'm as guilty of that as any number of people can be. I don't say it to be, I don't do that to be superior. It's just that I've sort of, I don't know, try to be funny at times, and that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So I guess you have to kind of think of, what's your sort of natural communication proclivities, and, are you in a situation where that's going to work well or poorly? And, as the saying goes, the higher up the tree the monkey goes, the more what you see of the monkey is his butt. So, basically as you get to more senior levels of management, your ability to present yourself well and to, figure out the audience you're communicating with becomes more and more important, and any gaffe or misstatement that you make is magnified by that. So, if you want to advance in the organization, you've got to learn how to deal with that and learn how to present yourself well, including not talking down to or condescending to your colleagues. Okay, I've got a number of people saying basically that the audio has been fine, so no music. 1 to 2 second drops. There were a couple cases where I had to mute the my microphone because I had coughing. The air up here is exceptionally dry, and my throat's kind of irritated. So that might be what some of you heard. Mary says, internet has some buffering problems depending on other locations. Don't think it's your connection. This one seems to be good. Now, last year we had a real problem with the internet connection up here, but we did get it solved. Let's see, Leon. I wish I knew whether I was pronouncing this right. It's supposed to be Leon or Leona, or Leone. How do you introduce quality and testing in an organization that is not used to planning? They're used to building and deploying with little thought to overall quality. Oh, my name is pronounced Leone. Okay, Leone. Thank you, Leone, helping me pronounce that correctly. Anytime you're going to try to make an organization, try to influence an organization to make a change, you have to figure out what the pain points are that you're going to address. So you're saying that your organization is, they just throw software together and deploy it, and they don't give a whole lot of thought about, well, does this work, and so forth. All right, how is that hurting the organization? What are the negative consequences of that behavior? And can you quantify or measure those in such a way that it will capture the attention of the people that you need it to capture the attention of, right? Is it money? Is it reputation? Is it delay of release? There has to be some sort of pain that's being caused by a situation. and that you can somehow measure or get your head around and be able to promise some significant reduction of in order to motivate the change. Because generally speaking, people really only make changes in their behaviors when there's a negative impact associated with those behaviors, and one that's significantly negative, that it overcomes that inertia that I was talking about before. So, Leonie, figure out the pain points and go from there, how testing can make those pain points go away or at least reduce them. Rodrigo, longtime listener Rodrigo, good to see you back, says, I work in an organization that uses a specific template to report the progress of the UAT. How do you suggest to approach the customization of the report to address the customer's needs? Well, I think it would matter here whether the UAT is being done by a set of people who are consistent from one project to the next, or if they vary. Because if they're consistent from one project to the next, then you can do a one-time effort to try to ascertain the information needs of that group of people to whom you're reporting the UAT progress, figure out what you're not giving them, and also what you're giving them that's not relevant, because usually there's both too much. It's usually too much data and not enough information is the general situation with test results reporting. So I would say figure that out. If it's going to be the same group of people over and over again, get your dashboard in place and then refine it. If it's a different set of people every time, then you can go through that process of coming up with sort of a basic template that you use, but then at the beginning of each project, you'll want to vet that with the people who are going to get the information, and that will probably result in some customization. That's how I would approach that personally. What I found is that there are some general kinds of information that can be consistently useful to people, and as I said before, it's really in any kind of metric, it's about figuring out how does this relate to an objective and going from there. Helga asks, any other best practices on metrics? Well, we're going to talk about more best practices next time, and I think some of them might have to do with metrics, but I did a webinar on testing metrics at one point, and it was recorded. You could go take a look at that. I might actually repeat that at some point. We also do a virtual class on testing metrics from time to time, and if we get enough interest, I'll put that on the schedule. So if any of you are out there listening and are interested in attending a 2-day virtual class on testing metrics, send us an email and we'll do that. All right, great. Well, this is a perfect timing here. Close the session, a little bit more about the resources available through RBCS. These webinars run once a month. They're free. On our website, rbcs-us.com, you will find the schedule. You can sign up there. If you want a in-house presentation of this webinar or any other topic related to software testing, send us an email via our website or at info@rbcs-us.com. You can also sign up for our newsletter at rbcs-us.com. This will get you valuable discounts on consulting and training services and a regular every other month newsletter, which includes a featured article on software testing and quality, along with news about what we're up to, our RBCS and our partners. We are on Twitter at RBCS and also on Facebook, RBCS-INC. Do remember to check your email over the next couple days, because you might be the lucky winner of a free e-learning course. You're registered for a random drawing simply by attending this event. And basically what we do is we use a random number generator to generate a random number between 1 and the total number of attendees, and whatever random number that comes up with, that's the winner. That's how that works. You can check out our digital library, which has recordings of these webinars along with podcasts and videos. So if anybody could benefit from hearing this presentation and they can't make this evening's session, you can send them to the digital library. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel as well, where these videos and recorded webinars can also be found. We offer these free services, free resources as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not just for profit company. This concludes the webinar. Thanks for joining us today. Hope to see you all on later webinars.